if you do remove in certain areas bits of your structure, you allow the breathing room to innovate, to fail fast, to try different things.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. So here's my story. This weekend, I was cleaning or doing something that I didn't want to be doing, whatever it was. And as is my way when I'm doing something that's kind of interminable and I just want to get through it, I turn on some like story-based podcast. So sometimes I listen to The Moth. Sometimes I listen to Hidden Brain or... Huh?
Us?
No, because that takes my brain in a whole other direction. But no, I was listening. I think it was an episode of This American Life. And I believe it might even be a repeat, but it was all about, I think it was called like Same Dreams, Different Beds or something like that. People who are together but have very different views on things. But interestingly...
That's a Chinese expression. That's an old...
Is it?
It's translated from an old Chinese expression.
Oh.
Yeah,
well,
Same Bed, Different Dreams.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, then that's probably the name of the episode. This is so unlike us. I'm giving so much direction to our dear friend Christy, who will have to go find these things normally on my vague, like it was a thing about a thing. And then there was like a girl who said something. Anyway, all right, back to the point. I was listening to This American Life, that episode, and they told this story about this couple who Kim Jong-il had kidnapped, I believe it was from South Korea, to come to North Korea to make movies. And make better movies than South Korea was making. And it's actually a fascinating story. There's all sorts of like twists and turns and all these sorts of things. But here is the part where I had that moment, as I know you have, where I'm like, oh, this should be an episode. He was talking to this couple about why he wanted them to make movies and why he was so excited at the first thing that they did. They did like some sort of little filming thing, whatever. And he was all excited because it was really good. And it was not like something that the South Koreans the North Koreans that he had making films for him would do. And this was the fascinating part. He said, apparently, this is why I invited you here. This is why I invited you here. Everybody, I have none of my people have any imagination. They're not creative. They don't step out. They don't do this, just this barrage of things, which because he is a terrifying dictator, as we know, who kidnaps people and has people killed and whatnot, you immediately are like, or, and they pointed this out. He said, what he wasn't aware of is that people weren't taking chances because it wasn't safe to be creative. Like you got points for, like, there was a very specific way that South Korean movies, North Korean movies worked. And you just really needed to do it that way. And that way you didn't get in trouble. You had low risk of there being like a problem, right?
Right.
And so this dynamic, I'm not saying that any of my clients have ever been, are dictators, but I hear this dynamic a lot where like, oh, I want my people to really stretch out there or say these things or be creative or be innovative. But when they are not doing that, it is certainly possible that sometimes the person just isn't creative or isn't innovative. But 9 times out of 10, I have seen that it's because there's some reason it's not safe to do so.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm struck by imagining what must have been that first conversation, trying to break the ice after the whole kidnapping thing.
I know.
I think that might be a little.
So many things in it. So many things that I'm like, how do you do it? Like, hey, thanks for coming, or hey, thanks for getting in the box we put you in.
Thanks for taking the hood off.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that. Obviously in even less extreme. So there's a spectrum here, and leaving North Korea out of it for just a second. In organizations, I see a spectrum. One is where people are legitimately afraid to try new things because they're afraid to fail. But on the other side, it's this unintentional thing where there are no penalties for taking risks, but there's so much structure that you feel that you're unable to. And I experienced this recently when I was talking about, and I have for, intermittently over the years, when marketing people have talked to me about, okay, here's our social media calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And if they say we should write 4 articles a month, I'm fine with that. But if they say this is going to be HR month and we're going to write about this,
right, give me 8 HR articles, right?
Yeah, I can't do it.
Right, and I bet you're also the other way, and I think we've talked about this before. If it just says, if it's completely open-ended, right? However, if there are no constraints, that's also hard. So like a little bit of constraints, like give me 8.
Yeah, it is hard. I do like to know the type of articles, but so, I know earlier this week, I was talking to Shelley, our marketing director, and she was saying, okay, let's do some articles, and Allie was weighing in on what kind of articles they were. But what I sent back was what I felt like writing about, which the first one was about hip hop. And
of course, because when I think hip hop, I think Elliot Wagenheim.
Well, because, and I really think, just as an aside, I really think there aren't a lot of old fat guys writing about hip hop, not that look like me anyway. And so I needed to fill that void, and I did. But my point is that sometimes if it's structure, I just can't. I'll stare at the screen. I can't write. I can't be creative on command.
Sure. Which we've talked about, that sort of like, hey, be creative now kind of thing. I do want to go back to something you said, though. You said where there's no penalty for being wrong. And yes, I'm talking about a dictator, but and so there probably were some like terrible penalties. So. But I think that's actually the point I kind of wanted to surface, is what people imagine as a penalty or a risk of being wrong. And there was this great quote where he wasn't just saying my people aren't creative. He was saying, this is actually really funny, my people have it too easy, that they don't have any, they don't hustle, they don't try, and they're not trying. He was making this assumption like they weren't trying. And the person doing the narration said this phrase that I thought was really powerful. He said, but I think what he didn't realize was it was better to be crappy than be sorry for a risk you took. And that level of risk, just even being sorry for the risk you took, risk doesn't have to mean you get beheaded for being wrong, or in a less dictatorly way, fired or demoted or whatever. I think being wrong, for better or for worse, usually for worse, is enough of a deterrent, being sorry that you took that chance. And so, where settling for crappy is better than being sorry. Like, how can you get your people to embrace being sorry, to not be sorry they took a risk, so that they can push past crappy, safe ease?
Well, I've seen companies, and I've read articles about companies that establish a culture in certain respects almost of celebrating failure, and not failure in a way that is central to their core business. Geez, we didn't realize that this building would fall over.
Good job killing 10 patients this week.
Yes,
Yay,
but he really tried.
But I like that you really experimented with the medication, swapped this one for that. Innovative.
But in those areas in your business that you have tagged as thriving only with creativity.
That's interesting.
So I think that you can carve out various niches where you can thrive with creativity, and that's where you concentrate on making failure a safe space. I don't think that you can make a company-wide culture. Shout out to Marianne Scully of Howard Bank, in banking, of thriving with failure. I don't think that Marianne would go, that's what we want to do. We want to celebrate.
That's it right there.
In banking.
Right.
But I do think that there may be areas, even in highly regulated industries, whether it's reaching out to the community or bringing people together and having various events, that you can create a much more lighthearted approach where you recognize and you start mining for the really good parts of failure that only arise because people took a chance.
Well, that's actually the whole point. It is because interestingly, the other thing that he said, and this blind spot, this felt important to me because of how often I hear this exact blind spot come up, where and it goes way beyond creativity and hustle, when people aren't acting the way you want them to do, and not just one person, like that may be a different situation, but when as a culture, people aren't acting the way you want them to, there is a shockingly high probability that it's because of the constraints or the issue. There's something happening that is affecting that behavior. Because one of the things that showed up in his blind spot that he didn't even notice was that he was allowing these two, when making these films, to do things that nobody else had ever been allowed to do. Like they said, well, we want to shoot this scene, so we really need to go to wherever it was, Prague, Berlin, I don't know. They flew somewhere and shot this scene and he loved the movie, but somehow didn't even notice that, like, up until that moment, a huge number of North Korean people had never, ever, ever seen any flash of anything that even showed the outside world, because there was just such this pervasive message of everything out there is dangerous and awful and everything in here is safe and good. And they believed that. And so allowing for like that major of a divergence from the rules that he had put on these other people. And he didn't even notice that had played into why they were able to make this really great movie. And so that blind spot of kind of the narrative you write about something without noticing the variables that are affecting it, I think is something to really take a look at.
Well, and I think that, just with that specific example, I'm reminded that in my profession, in my world, consistency is what you strive for. If I have a conversation, when I have a conversation with a client and they say, well, can we do that in this personnel situation? Invariably, I'd be saying, well, yes, as long as you do it across the board. Because it's so much safer for companies not to make an exception.
Right.
Because there's danger there. Well, you're not treating me the same as you're treating her. And so there's a defensiveness there. And so a lot of organizations will apply rules across the entire organization, regardless of the different functions and the different makeup, the different personality, the different ingredients for success that may vary from department to department. That's
a really important point, because I think it's what scares people about innovation sometimes and why you put rules in place. But if you can separate the two things for a moment from a more, or not even separate them, but look at them from more of a 30,000 foot view, maybe, is where do you want and need consistency? And and this is another important point, you already know enough that you can put constraints around something and you're not putting something else at risk. And where do you not know enough yet? And where do you need to beta test? Where do you need to find small ways to get a thing out there? I heard a story the other day from a tech startup whose initial offering out into the market, which made perfect sense at the time, was in the form of an iPad app, an iPhone app, and they were going to merge into like the Android world as well, instead of doing a web-based thing. Like that was just sort of considered best practices or whatever, kind of the right way to do it. So they invested in that. They actually spent quite a lot of money in it, but they are in the educational space. And the very first conference that they went to, their entire business model was based on then having these little upgrades, the little in-app purchases for blocks of additional material of the thing that they were doing. And overwhelmingly, they heard that most districts don't allow in-app purchases. It's just not a thing. So as an overarching business model, not a good way to go. Right. Just like terrible. And so to go back to the drawing board, that is a place where, if you're developing something new, if you're trying to go into new territory, if you're trying to found a thing that doesn't exist or expand into a market you've never been in, that is where you want and need people to be super creative, but also find, what do they say, like fail fast, find small ways to dip a toe in and get feedback and information back so you can tweak and adjust and navigate and adapt. And that's what gets cut off if people are afraid to be wrong. I mean, that's a great story. If this was a much bigger company, that person could feel like, oh, like I was wrong to go this path. And maybe they should have figured that out sooner, but still they figured it out. And soon enough, they didn't go and do the Android one as well before figuring it out. So maybe it's also being a little bit more clear about what's failure and what is testing.
Right. I think that's true. I also think it's true that when you eliminate certain little bits of your structure, you allow more breathing area. So, for example, breathing room. So, for example, I have heard quite a few companies and been in a lot of conversations about how there's been a burst of creativity and productivity in areas where these companies didn't expect it. And they traced it back to the quarantine. And the reason they traced it back to the quarantine is they realized, and there are examples in law, which, as you know, is a very regimented business model, and in medical offices and places where you wouldn't expect it. Because, for example, they found that people weren't kept in that box of 9 to 5, and so they were allowed to work at times that are best for them and do things that were best for them. And so all of a sudden, they were seeing a lot more creativity, a lot more initiative, a lot more proposals coming in, where they didn't expect it. They thought in quarantine, everybody's in their own bubble and there's no interaction. And so therefore it's going to be suffocating, when it was freeing in many ways.
Yeah, it's been a mixed bag in that, right, I think.
Yeah, and that really exemplifies that if you do remove in certain areas bits of your structure, you allow the breathing room to innovate, to fail fast, to try different things.
Totally. And there's a slightly different angle, because we've been talking a lot about like creativity and innovation and ingenuity. But I think this potential blind spot we're looking at here also applies to things like a thing I hear quite often about sort of wishing more employees thought like owners or understood the bigger picture you were trying to do or whatever. And without fail, one of my first questions, this part isn't the without fail part. One of my first questions when I hear that is, well, what do you share with them? What do they have line of sight to? What do they see about the thing that you see? And very often they don't see anything, and they don't get any of that information. They're not getting walked through the decisions. And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying share everything with all of your employees all the time. Not that, but whether it's about, I want them to understand, when people are harumphy about, well, why do we have this budget? Harumphy, that's a word. Okay. It's my word. About budget things. Well, have you ever had them grapple with, an exercise around how you would do the discretionary budget as just almost like a team building exercise, and see how, break them into groups and see how they do that? Or have you ever, which by the way, I did not make up. I have a client, one of my favorite clients, who is actually doing something kind of like that right now with her team. Or are you having them, I have another conversation I was hearing the other day where someone's really frustrated that, especially as younger folks, don't always think of all the things that he thinks of. So they miss things sometimes in the bigger picture. He's a very creative problem solver kind of guy, and they're young and they haven't been as experienced. And, we were talking about how to help them see what he sees, which is probably going to entail slowing down that movie that plays in his head in 3 seconds so that they can see it frame by frame. He's going to have to kind of narrate some of that. And it was so interesting because he took that as well, I can't follow them around and help them make every decision. You got to teach them to fish and blah, blah. And I was like, no. I'm asking you to teach them to fish by slowing it down so they can see what fishing looks like. Because you're fishing in a nanosecond, and they need to see first you bait the hook, and that's how you learn to fish, is seeing the pieces.
Yeah, and I'm going back to your story. I think that the disappointment from, I don't know whether you said Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il.
It was Il.
But was that he laid down so many rules, and then was expecting creativity, but there was no room for creativity because he laid down so many rules.
Yeah, some of them death and dismemberment
Right.
and whatnot.
Well, that was the penalty. So he was giving them a fish. He wasn't teaching them to fish because he had already done that in laying out everything. He was just saying, here, this is it.
Yeah, this is it. It can't be anything except this. And then he was bummed that that's all he got. And that blind spot, like when you can deconstruct that blind, and what fascinates me about this is it never feels like a blind spot. But and it's why I wanted to surface this conversation, sort of backing it up to, if any version of you are frustrated that people aren't acting the way you want them to, it's a great place to look under the hood to say, is this because it's not safe to do the thing I want to do, or they need it slowed down so they see frame by frame? Like, what is teaching them to fish in this version versus giving them a fish?
And, so I think of it as I go through this kind of bizarre exercise when I think of things like this, because I know you're going to laugh, but if for any initiative, let's say that I wanted people to come up with this really creative solution, I wanted these movies or whatever the dictator wanted, I would picture being interviewed about my success. And the one question the interviewer asked me is, how did you get your people to be so creative? And then I'd have to answer it. And so if I have to answer it, and the question is, were your people creative? It's just, how did you enable that?
Oh, I love that.
How
did you create a team of people who can think this way? How did you, that's so interesting.
So then if you have to go through that exercise and you have to answer the question, well, first and what would you say?
That is so fast. Now I'm super fascinated. Now I want to do an episode on this. Why that access is like a totally different part of my brain. Like, because if I said, I want people to be creative, like, what do I need to do to make them creative? If I'm standing in the present looking forward,
right,
I get a little stumped depending on, I'm like, I guess I could try this. But if I zoom to the past and zoom to the future and imagine myself being interviewed, that's an important part of it too. Like,
right,
because there's reason to be interviewed. So it's sort of, I guess it's the presumed
that you made.
Yeah, like, what did you do to make this way?
Yeah.
Gosh, I can apply that to entrepreneurship, to parentship, to like all sorts of things.
It trips in a part of the brain. I found this in discussions with clients. It trips into that part of the brain where people are giving advice. Right. So they're not trying to cure their own problem. They're not trying to say, geez, what do I do? What do I do? But now they're giving advice. They're saying, well, this is how I did it. And you might want to think about. And I found, at least for me personally, and in discussions I've had, I found that to be kind of a really useful trick in approaching the problem in a different way by looking back.
Yeah, because it's holding up. It's a way to access your own mirror. I mean, people say that all the time. I'm great at this for other people, but I can't do it for myself. It's because you're so in it.
Right.
Whereas that
for others
gives you a way to get out. We always joke about watching someone else parallel park a car. It's a little bit getting out of the car and seeing it from the outside. Oh my gosh. That's really profound, Elliot.
Well,
how have I never heard this? Because it's really funny. Sometimes I do wonder, like, at what point will we have heard each other's, like, all of our stories, all of our tidbits of wisdom? Like, yeah, you said that, or yeah, we did.
That was episode 7. I got that. Yeah.
Well, the good news is we can barely remember 3 episodes ago.
Well, no, that's true. After we finish the episode, we're like, we need a title. What do we talk about?
Yeah, I know. So we're going to be those old people who like tell the same. It was really, for people listening, they're like, dude, you already tell the same stories like over and over and over again. Yeah. But no, I've never heard that. And that is really profound wisdom. I like that.
We can end on that.
Okay.
Because I like to end. I rarely end on being profound. I always muck it up somehow.
3, 2, 1, profound.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group.
Which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts.
Your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village,
Yes, it does.
we'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky
Ooh,
team.
yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of
Lovingly
ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Including wrangling us.
Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.